started. Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to Executive Scrutiny Board, Tuesday the 12th of December, Christmas budget special. First of all, item 1 is apologies, of which we have none.
Chair.
Oh, Councillor Holmes. Late items to be introduced by the Chair. There are none, but you should have all had an extra piece of paper. Very good. Item 3 is declarations of interest, which will bring us to the meat of our meeting, which is item 4, the Cabinet Budget Proposals 2018-2019. Before I invite Mark to present the budget, just a couple of things. Firstly, is not every member here is a member of the Scrutiny Board. I will invite everyone to speak. Obviously, if there are formal recommendations going forward, they will need to be voted on by the members of the board, if indeed we get to that. I don't think it will have escaped anyone's attention that actually what we're scrutinising tonight are very outlined proposals. And if you were looking for a whole host of intricate minutiae of detail, it's not there. This is the first of 3 opportunities that we will have as members to input into the budget process. When it comes back to the Scrutiny Board as the budget before it goes to the Cabinet, and then thirdly, obviously, in all the fun of the full Council. So really, I think as board members tonight is for us to take the opportunity to feed into that process, to perhaps get some more detail, maybe ask or propose the sort of detail we would like to see in future proposals, and start formulating any wonderful alternatives that we may want to put forward, should they come to us. We have senior officers here tonight, we have cabinet members. We will be able to ask questions, and what I will do is ask that people we'll try and field those questions by the most appropriate person. I don't really want to get into a scenario where we start directing questions towards people, but rather that we get as close to the facts as possible. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Mark, and you'll tell us all about this budget, Mark.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. I apologise in advance for some of you who've already seen this presentation probably 2 or 3 times. I have, over the last few weeks, briefed all of the opposition groups and earlier on in the year the press as well, so the information is hopefully consistent. In addition to that, in your papers we did include the actual consultation document, which sort of gives an overview of the main issues around the budget. I'll go quite quickly through this to give you as much opportunity as possible to ask questions. So, headlines for the budget. We are projecting a balanced revenue budget for 18-19 without any further use of reserves. You recall for 17-18 we are expecting to utilise something like 5.6 million of our reserves to make sure the budget balances. The capital budget has basically been completely revamped during the year, and we've now got an effective gateway programme process which allows us to identify projects very early and follow them as they progress through. So this process started around about June, July, and we worked very closely with Cabinet to identify what are their key projects and what is the phasing and timing of those projects likely to be. So for 18-19, the major project is the pool. It's in the capital programme at 33 million, phased over 3 years, and I'm more than happy, by the way, to give you the full capital programme detail, which does cover not just 1918, which we're consulting on, but the future years as well, so you can see where things fit in. Our reserves at the moment reflect a reasonable position for financial stability. Our strategic reserve still sits at 8.7 million. I am going to make a request to Council to increase that to 11 million, because as you'll see as the budget debate goes through, we are taking a little bit more risk into the budget this year, and we need to make sure that we've got funds to cover that. And our treasury management strategy, reflecting all of our planned capital expenditure, indicates that we will have no need to borrow until after 2021. So at the moment we've got borrowings of around about 360 million of loans, additional funds in terms of PFI commitments and what have you, and of that the Council, about 230 relates to the HRA and 110 to the Council. So it's a fairly, for a Council with a balance sheet of something like £1.5 billion, the level of borrowing that the Council has is quite low. And that's a good, prudent thing. Despite all this and coming up with a balanced budget, we are having to raise council tax, and the planned increase in council tax is set at 1.99%. As you will recall, there is a cap set by the government that if council set a tax above 2%, they must go for a referendum. So we're setting it at 1.99. And in addition to that, we are applying a 3% precept for adult social care. I think last year you would have decided that councils had a series of options on adult social care, as long as they didn't increase it by more than 6% over the 3 years and not more than 3% in any 1 year. So this council chose to do a 3% and a 3% rather than a 2-2-2 or a 3-1-2 or any other combination thereof. As a result of that, the Band D council tax increases by around about £65 a year, which works out about £1.25 a week for an average Band D council city home, around about 18 pence a day, which is not a huge increase. However, I would add that we, in line with many councils, that general level of increase in council tax will come to a point where some of our households will not be able to afford it. And they're probably the ones, you may have heard them referred to as the jams, they're just about managing households. So we do need to take due recognition of that, but we do have the council tax reduction scheme, which people can apply for if they are unable to meet their council tax liabilities. As I said earlier, we are making some risks around the assumptions in the budget this year. Normally these would be reflected as pressures in the budget, then you'd have to increase your savings, which means either less staff or less things that we can do. So in conversation with Cabinet through the summer, we decided that unless we are absolutely clear that there is a clear risk of that risk crystallising, we'll carry it as an assumption. So the key assumptions are there. First one is that interest rates remain stable. Well, we've seen the Bank of England step in with the first increase in a number of years with a 0.25%. And I think the general view from the places like the Office of Budget Responsibility in the Bank of England is that they will only enter into an increase in interest rates if they feel that inflation is moving out of control. Inflation, again, we're expecting it to remain at current levels, the target level set by the Bank of England. And again, that intervention in October by increasing interest rates by 0.25 was to try and cap off some of the inflation pressures which are coming through as a result of sterling depreciation as we continue to negotiate Brexit. Assumption 3, which seemed to be very sound a couple of weeks ago, now perhaps less so, was that we would continue to live with the 1% public pay cap. You may be aware that in Philip Hammond's speech, he did not change that, so the cap remains, although he did suggest that he might listen to specific requests, specifically in respect of nurses in the NHS. Since that, the NJC, which is the local authority group, have indicated that they would like to consider a 2% pay award rather than 1% pay award. And the latest information I have on that is that there is a general petition from the LGA that if it goes to a 2%, that the government will fund that centrally. It's still a risk, so I'm holding it as a risk. We're still assuming 1%, and we'll hold to that until it changes. And then assumption 4 was that the government didn't give us any more money, very unlikely, or take any more money away from us. So we're still waiting for the settlement, so that assumption remains uncertain. But in the Chancellor's budget speech, there was nothing that really altered the funding platform for local authorities. Just as an aside, I think in the packs you've got, the impact of those, if they all went wrong, it would probably be about an extra £3.5–4 million on our budget. So, in terms of this is a summary of the balance of our budget proposition over the next 3 years. So 17-18, we are still forecasting for this year a break-even position. We are identifying pressures, but managers are working hard to keep those contained. So I think we will get to a balanced position, there or thereabouts. For 18-19, again, we're forecasting a balanced budget position without the use of reserves. And similarly in 19-20, we've got a small surplus, but that's probably just fine-tuning on the budget model, which again says that we will have a balanced budget. However, and forgive me, Councillor Repton, I will quote it, there are clouds on the horizon. We can see that as we look further out, the demand pressures for adult social care, which we are trying desperately to contain, will start to grow back as the 85-year-olds really start to come through. We are still seeing major increases in the level of looked after children and their needs and requirements. And of course, the further out you look, the less certainty there is around our assumptions around income and cost-based pressures. So, first 2 years of the plan balanced, the final year currently looking like a £7.5 million deficit. And that is a pretty good position. Most councils are projecting at the total value cited today of budget deficits planned for next year is around about 5.7 billion across all local authorities. That's the latest number I saw in an email today. So we're doing pretty well to be looking at a balanced budget. However, that's not without making some quite powerful assumptions, and we're still very much early in the process of receiving settlement numbers from the government. In terms of the pressures, again, these are detailed out. I won't go through every one, but we will happy to come back to these and you can challenge them and review them in more detail. But in total, pressures in terms of individual service pressures, we're looking at £2.5 million. In terms of inflationary pressures, we've got that 1% pay award, care home contractual increases made around those, and we've also got some specific pressures around household waste and external placements. That's children's external placements, where we have to, forgive me, Andy, you're probably able to explain far better than I, but we do use external providers for those placements, and they can be quite expensive depending on the child's needs. So total inflation pressure is 2.6, and then we look at the savings. Hopefully you've had a chance to review the savings, because in the consultation document there's a bit more detail around each one, but generally speaking, most of these savings were identified in last year's MTFP. There are very few, if any, new savings, but what we have done is reflected what we've achieved last year and therefore what we still need to achieve in next year. So the classic one there, sorry, not in that one, but in that one, would be in the centre of the screen, the libraries savings, whereby we've delayed the library process in terms of getting off the ground, but that's now in consultations complete, and I think the assessment of potential organisations that would run those libraries is well on track, but I still think there's a little bit of uncertainty around how quickly those bodies can take control and then make those savings through. So the savings of 337 is effectively the tail end of it. And again, I'll come back to these slides so we can challenge each of the savings individually, if you wish. Savings proposals in O&G, again the same, and perhaps the biggest one is those staffing efficiencies, the 3.3. It is the biggest saving target in the whole proposals, and I'm sure you'll want to come back and ask us more questions on that. In terms of the capital programme, which again equally forms part of the budget process, we currently plan to spend something like £108 million on capital projects next year, many of which are directly funded. So we get funding from either the DFE for the schools investment or Department of Transport for road network investments, and we do get funding through the Local Growth Fund from the LEP. So there's quite a lot of funding that comes through, but we do still need to fund some of those projects ourselves, and I suppose the most important one is within that second to bottom line major projects. And if I flick through to that, these are the key major projects, and they're probably familiar to you. The swimming pool is the key project for investment from the Cabinet's proposals for beginning next year. It's spread over 3 years. Phasing may change depending on how well the contractors progress once they're on site. Our City, Our River, again, another major project for the city. Just to bear in mind that is only funded, we only expend when we get the funding in. So that's assumed to be coming through and spent on the basis that we will attract those funds. So that will change. And the A52, I'm back in Herefordshire. A52 transport scheme, which is now well underway. You're probably enjoying the traffic congestion it's causing. But it's well underway, and again, that's considerably funded by LGF and the Department of Transport. And then the last one, the waste disposal plant. This is a major project between Derbyshire and ourselves in terms of generating a heat and power plant. It's still in the throes of construction, but it's getting close to completion. I think the original completion date was expected to be late this year, 17-18. I think our revised completion date is now around about July, when it will be fully commissioned. So that's a £25 million commitment that this council made quite some years ago. I can't remember the exact date, Christine, 2010? Something like that. Contracts then signed in 2014. So it's quite a long-standing commitment. So, in summary, I think the council's proposals, budget proposals, are deliverable and reasonably robust. You do have a fairly substantial level of reserves that will deal with issues if and when they arise. We are only required to set the council budget for 1 year, for 18-19. That's a statutory requirement. But when we come to issue the papers, which Jack was saying, there's plenty of other opportunity to review this, we will provide you with the full medium-term financial plan, so you've got a much broader view of what we're actually looking to do, in particular around the capital programme, where it puts out in more detail what those projects are and how they're funded, and indeed we'll put a bit more flesh on the bone with the actual MTFP summary for the revenue budget, treasury management policy, and reserves positions. So that was all I was going to say as the introduction. Hopefully you've had a chance to consider the consultation document which is in your packs, and we are happy to answer any questions you may have.
Councillor Bayliss.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of things. I entirely agree with you in terms of that high-level view on this, because it is an opportunity for people to start formulating, if they wish, alternative budgets and suggestions for the budget both now and as the process unfolds, leading obviously to the theatre of full council next year. Two questions for Mark, really. Firstly, there has been announcements today of inflation rates which seem to be in line with the proposal at the moment, but that may just because it's a spot rate rather than an annualised rate. So I just wondered if you could comment on that. And the second point is, just remind me why we're so far behind with the waste treatment plant.
Sorry, Councillor.
The waste treatment plant, why are we so far behind with it?
Okay. With regard to inflation, clearly inflation moves on a regular basis. I've taken the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility forecasts, and the Bank of England forecasts. There are many pundits that provide inflation information to ourselves that I can draw on. I have to say, probably the most prudent one is from our Treasury Management advisors, who believe inflation is going to remain unmoved for the next 5 years, virtually. And that complies with their interest rate forecast as well. I think the Bank of England information does reflect what's actually happening in the market at that particular point in time. OBR tends to smooth that through. I suppose the real downside risk is still Brexit and the uncertainty around the value of sterling. If that changes dramatically, then inflation will be sucked in. I still remember the oil crisis in the 70s when oil prices went up and had a massive impact on the UK economy. I don't think anyone's expecting it to be massive, but it could be substantial. I think that's why I would like to see increasing in our strategic reserve this year as we go into 2018-19, so that we've got a little bit more resistance to deal with that if it comes through. I think we're fairly safe on contract inflation, because most of those are long-term contracts. It's actual just general retail price inflation for our goods and services that we buy spot. Set against that, if you look at the construction side, where we're looking to spend quite a lot of money on construction, then those rates are actually falling because people are pausing major projects, so contractors are looking for good value projects to get in and develop. So we might actually get a really good price for the pool when we go out to procure. But I think it's something to be watching, and it's the UK economy, as it increasingly stands alone from Europe, is much more susceptible to the vagaries of the global markets. And we know what global market financiers can do to a currency. We still remember the Black Friday. With regards to the waste plant, I don't know, Christine, you've probably got more information.
Yeah, the situation with the waste plant, I think, has been discussed in public and in the press previously. The main delay, as we sit here today, relates to the subcontractors for Interserve that went into administration earlier in the year, and that has meant a delay for Interserve because they had to sort out how they could carry on doing that work, and that was a key part of the technical the technical equipment within the plant, and so it was a key stage when that contractor went out of business, and it's just taken a number of months for that to resolve itself. So the timetable we have now is that we expect the plant to be operating in July 2018.
Just for clarity, Christine, and the cost of delay of that, is that shouldered by the two councils, the authorities, or with the
No, the contract that the two councils have with RRS protects us from all of those additional costs, and we don't pay our contribution of 25 million until we have an operational plant.
Councillor Peck.
Yeah, it's on the capital investment sheet, Appendix 2. When you go through this, it's fine. I would just like to see a bit more clarity on where some of the money's coming from. For instance, we have on the original documents, although it's changed on the new ones, Mackworth War Memorial, it says regeneration. I would like to see in brackets section 106 where all that money's coming from throughout the city. Also, otherwise, we're only going to be accused of spending money that isn't section 106 money.
Thank you, Councillor Pegg, for reminding me. I forgot to apologise for including the wrong Appendix 2. That's actually the 17-18 forecast rather than the 18-19 budget, so apologies for that. I think, reflecting possibly some other councillors who may have questions around the capital programme, what I propose to do, we've now got a much more detailed schedule, so if you're comfortable, I'll circulate that in advance, and that'll cover the full 4 or 5 years of the capital programme, and it'll show more clearly where those individual projects are funded and how they're sourced. Is that okay?
Councillor Carr.
Thank you, Chair. The document indicates that there's likely to be some impact on personnel. What I'd like to know is there a timescale for it? Says it's unassessed at the moment. That provides a lot of uncertainty for some of our hard-pressed staff. Can we have a firm timescale on how we're going to make that assessment and when, please? Chair.
I'll take that one, Councillor Carr. It's based on an assumption that across the entire council of 3,000 plus employees, certain employees are probably, how can I put this nicely, they're perhaps not putting in everything that they could possibly do. They may have other issues or concerns at home. They may be having a struggle to do with the jobs that they've got. We've implemented a new performance management system this year, and we'll monitor that. We've increased, as you know, I think we've reported to Scrutiny before through the performance routes on sickness and absence, which is very high. And what we're endeavouring to do is to make sure that those individuals are managed and, where necessary, perhaps guided towards making a different career choice. As I say, the assumption is broad, and there's a lot of work to do to get that through. For example, we won't have the results of the management the MIPS, can't remember what an acronym is now, managing individual performance, until April probably. But that assumption is based on that we'll deal with something like 200 employees, and we'll get about 100. 100 will actually leave the organisation, and those posts will be removed. As I say, if people aren't performing generally, then someone else is doing it already, so you probably don't need to replace it. But it will be a very, we will use all the empathy we can to ensure that the process is as painless as possible. But for those individuals affected, there are some stark realities that they may have to consider. But it will be done as best as we can.
Christine, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I think what we're trying to reflect is a significant amount of cost within the budget is staffing, and I think from an officer perspective we just have to have a renewed vigour around all of the opportunities that we've got to reduce staff costs. So some of this will be about being more a bigger drive towards supporting people who want to go on voluntary redundancy, as well as looking at transformation projects and taking out the staff costs as and when they arise. So I don't think that, other than we've talked about the high performance things and the attendance management, it's just a continual drive on getting on top of our staffing costs and driving them down as much as we can, but having a minimum impact on service delivery. So it's it's going to be difficult, and it's not going to be, you know, in particular areas. I think it's just this continual drive to get our costs down, trying to do it in an efficient and effective way.
Anybody else? Councillor Webb.
You can always rely on me to ask questions. Mark, can you explain again our reserve situation? Because the way I heard you say it, we got 11 million in reserves, and looking at usable reserves on page 11, we've got total of 199 million. So if you can explain that. And the other one, we've had conversations about the budget in adult social care and how the additional government funding of around 22 million pounds last year, this year and the following years, so 1920, how that is seen within the adult social care budget, and then how do we see the 3% precept in that budget? That's asking for a lot of detail, but I think we need to know how much we are paying for care within this authority and how much of that care is supported by external funding.
Happy to respond to those too. In terms of the reserves, as you can see, we have a very healthy level of reserves. Some of those reserves are ring-fenced, so they included in that will be the HRA reserves of about 40 million. School balances, I think around 10 million. So there will be some reserves that whilst we hold them and they are usable by us, we can't actually apply them just generally. Within those reserves, there's currently an £8.7 million, which is a general fund strategic reserve. And that's set by a benchmark against the SITFA recommendations of between 3 and 5% of net revenue. And that's really to deal with big things when they happen, unexplained things like a major flood in the city. We'll have the cash to resolve those. Because we're making certain assumptions in the budget, which are risky, they may go wrong, I'm going to ask Council if we can increase that strategic reserve to 11 million, which is at the top of the 5%, but will allow the Council to have sufficient reserves at hand to deal with any of these risks as they come through. So if that inflationary spike becomes a trend, we will have to spend more on our cost base. So we need to be able to respond to that and do it. If I can give you a little bit of a clip, the accounts for 16-17 have now been audited. They were published today, and there's an updated reserve schedule in there which gives you much more detail about what's usable, unusable, ring-fenced, unring-fenced. With regard to the adult social care, this is the BCF, mainly the BCF funding and the 3% adult social care. Can I give you some assurance that we are challenged every year by DCLG and the DFE to be able, we have to respond to them on an annual basis and absolutely show how we have used those funds to pay for the significant costs of adult social care across the council. I'm sure Andy and Alison can explain this far better than I, but I'm certain that we can, because it's a document we submit to DCLG, it might even be available, and that will explain, it just shows you everything that we spent and how we spent it. Behind that, when we get to the detailed part of the budget, once we've agreed the principles, we will be providing a budget book which will show you again gross to net in each of the key directorates, so that will give you further information.
I think Andy and Alison first.
I'll have to use Alison's microphone. I haven't got a microphone. It's going to be budget cuts. Clearly can't back with the microphones. Just to try and answer your question, Roy, I could spend all night talking about the Better Care Fund, but I'll try and answer it as logically as I understand it anyway. If you think about the Better Care Fund, there are essentially two pots. There's the original Better Care Fund, which we've been receiving since 2013. And we receive about 11 million of the Better Care Fund that comes directly to the council via lots of conversations with the CCG. It's not new money, essentially. It's money that was taken away from council budgets and then recycled back, and it was called Better Care Fund, which is all around the way in which adult social care and health integrate. And that 11 million pays for frontline adult social care services in the council. So it pays for our Home First team, it pays for a lot of our frontline social work activity. And then, because of pressures in the system that directors of adult services and the King's Fund and others were really reporting back to government, the government finally listened to the pressures in the system and introduced what's called the Improved Better Care Fund. And there are essentially two pots of Improved Better Care Fund, but it all comes together into one pot. But part of that money comes straight to the council as opposed to bypassing through the NHS. And that is really for pressures in adult social care. So we've got the original Better Care Fund that's paying for your frontline adult social care services at the tune of 11 million. And then we've got Improved Better Care Fund, which this year equates to just under £6 million. And that is paying for pressures around demographic increases in terms of the increasing population, increasing care costs that come along with that. It's paying for inflation costs. It's paying for pressures that we've got around the increase in mental capacity assessments and deprivation of liberty assessments. It's paying for our hospital social work team so that we can get more patients out of hospital when they're ready to be discharged, so we haven't got delayed transfers of care. And as I think many of you may know, Derby is number 7 in the country out of 152 local authorities for delayed transfers of care, which means that when older people in the main are ready to come out of hospital, there isn't a delay because of a social care need. And that's exceptional performance, and that's around the Better Care Fund and the way in which our services are integrated into the RDH, into the hospital, and are working effectively to transition and pathway customers out of the system. The precept, which this year was about 2.4 million, was really around tackling the pressures in the system, demographic pressures and inflation. The challenge we've got as a local authority, which all local authorities have got, is that the Improved Better Care Fund tapers off. So it isn't going to be a recurring pot of money. So a challenge we've had in the service is, how do we really try and ensure that tackles the pressures, knowing that if we put a whole lot of extra capacity in the system, then we're going to have a potential problem down the line because there's going to be no money. Now, the government are going to undertake a consultation in the summer of next year. It's been kicked into the summer around the future of adult social care funding, which one will hope will come up with some sustainable solutions in the long term. But it is a pressure for us because, as Mark has said, and as has been said plenty of times by Councillor Epton, the demographic time bomb is absolutely upon us in terms of that rising 85 population. And younger people with learning disabilities and really severe disabilities essentially now surviving well into their middle and older age, and that creating a pressure on the system.
Thank you, Andy. Did you have any further questions, Councillor Webb?
Yeah, just come back and say, yes, I understand what Andy's saying, but there is nowhere in this budget process that clearly identifies adult social care year on year and the increases or decreases in the budget for adult social care year on year on year. So I feel that this ought to be more properly detailed within the budget document, so you don't have to go looking through reams of paper to find out what our adult social care cost is and whether it is increasing or decreasing year on year.
Add to that?
Again, for this year, we've looked at building the budget from a gross to net. So we'll take the whole of the income that comes in from government grants, our fees and charges, all sources, and then the expenditure against that to get to a net budget. So that information is available, and we will present it as part of the Cabinet report, as part of the MTFP. If you want the very, very detail within adult social care, then we can provide that trend analysis from, I don't know, if we go back to 15, 16? So 15, 16, 16, 17, 17, 18, 18, 19, so you can see where that flows through, because it is big numbers. When we look at the gross, the total value, I think it was something like £395 million that we allocate to the People's Directorate. A substantial proportion of that is for schools DSG. So I guess that's the analysis you'd like to see. We'll try and work that out for you, Councillor Webb.
Anybody else? I'll take Councillor Williams, then Councillor Poulter. Yvonne, sorry, can you press your mic?
Rookie mistake. Shan't make it again. Sorry, my first question is on the review of commission care costs. I just would really like to understand a bit more about how it costs 400,000? What are the details of that? Why does it cost so much to do a review? How's that broken down? That's my first question. Thank you.
Andy?
Yeah, so what that, it's not so much a review in terms of completing a review, it's to do with the pressures around the impact of the living wage on the way in which we commission care from the sector. So we need to make sure that our proposals and the way in which we set our fee rates and that we contract with the sector reflects the living wage and that we have got a competitive rate. Because if we have a fee rate that's too low and not seen to be competitive, A, we're not fulfilling our statutory responsibilities in terms of what the Care Act says, which is to pay a reasonable rate, to stimulate the market as best as you're able to, and to ensure that you've got the right market for the right kind of customers that need to be in maybe residential care or nursing care. And of course, and our rates are, I think, are very reasonable and are fair and are lower than some other parts of the East Midlands in terms of a unitary authority. So it's just about making sure that we've got a rate that's balanced, that is reflecting of the market and that's competitive and that reflects the living wage, essentially, is what this is talking about. Not to do that would create risk for the council in terms of judicial review, which some authorities have experienced if they set the rates too low. So it's really to reflect really the living wage.
Do you have another question, Councillor Williams?
Thank you. My second question, again, Mark, I think it's been touched on by Councillor Pegg, but I'd be very interested to understand with the appendix to the capital investment programme actually where the funding does come from. I would like to see a breakdown of that so it helps us understand it a bit more to where it has come from, the likelihood of us getting it for the future. That would be really good if we could have that, please.
Happy to provide that schedule. We'll get it out, circulated around by the end of this week.
Councillor Poulter. Then Councillor.
Yes, thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. So on the service pressures list, there's one for unplanned tree management costs of 280,000 and one of £500,000 in relation to increased property maintenance costs. The second one seems to be in conflict with part on the capital budget in terms of essential major maintenance and total property improvement refurbishment. How have we come by? What are those costs, please, and why are they precious?
Take it, Christine.
Christine?
On the tree management costs, essentially we've been carrying out a review this year as to where we are in our tree management service, and I think because of previous efficiencies and trying to reduce our spend in these areas, we've got to a point where actually we now need to put some more money back into that area because there are significant issues with some of our trees in parks and the highway trees. So I think this is just, we've done a review of that service and we're reflecting on the fact that we need to put some more money back into that service. The property maintenance costs, the 500,000 additional in revenue really relates to, again, We looked at doing a significant more amount of work through the capital programme where we had bigger pieces of work that needed to be done. But actually, because we're trying to minimise the amount of work we're doing to properties where they might be subject to property rationalisation, actually that's a revenue cost. So again, we're just having to add something back into the revenue programme to make sure that we can keep our properties open and, you know, dealing with all of the health and safety and legislative requirements. And sorry, can you just... it was the capital programme. So the property schemes on the capital programme, they are, they're bigger schemes that are eligible to be funded out of capital as opposed to smaller maintenance schemes that have to be funded out of revenue.
Councillor Poulter?
Yeah, thanks. So in relation to the trees, is it more work or is it more staff, the 280,000?
It's a combination. Some of it is to increase the number of inspectors that we have to go around and do the surveys of the trees, but a significant proportion is actually to retain some more of our operational staff that will actually do work to the trees.
Chair, the next question is in relation to one of the savings. It's a relatively small amount, but it's £80,000 in withdrawing the discounted travel for young people. I'm just wondering where that leaves us in terms of any subsidies for young people, and I wouldn't want to do anything that discourages young people from using the buses and puts more family cars back on the road delivering children to school. So what's those savings, please?
This was the second year in a saving of a service that's a discretionary service where the council, together with the county council, contributes a third of the cost of the travel for young people. It's a discretionary service, so it's something that there was a commitment to unfortunately have to withdraw from. Clearly it's part of this consultation. We've obviously spoken to Voices in Action. They've made their comments known as well, and you know, I'm sure this will be added to, and members cabinet members will look at that through the consultation.
Yeah, I think I'd like to see the detail of the effects of that, certainly, and in some more detail. My last point, it was Mark's touched on the fact that we got the 16-17 capital programme. Is that what you're saying, rather than the 17-18 one? Yes. Okay. Well, fortunately, it does raise my general point on the capital programme. Mark, have discussed concerns over the capital programme in committee and in other ways, in that it clearly shows that there's a lot of carryover of the work on the capital programme to the 18-19 budget in effect. And the concern around that was around unrealistic capital programmes and people putting in things into capital programme that weren't actually necessary and working, and the intention or the benefits of reducing the capital programme. In actual fact, now with the latest figures we've ended up with, there's a significant increase in the capital programme, and that begs the question: is where are we going to get the extra capacity to deliver that capital programme, and are we not in danger of making the same mistakes?
If I can come back to you on that one. In terms of the shift, the bulk of that movement from 17-18 to 18-19 is the 25 million for the waste plant. With regard to the sort of a more overall view of the capital programme, I think it's natural with every council I've worked for that managers will put the most optimistic hat on when they want to get the capital programme put together. They'll put everything in, as many of the pet projects as they possibly can, and then as you go through the year you find that they're not going to be delivered, and then you consider them whether they roll forward or roll back. I think if we look at this year's capital programme to date, against that 72 million forecast, At the end of December, we've only spent about 30 million of that, so there's still a big ask, but we've got big projects like the A52 now underway, and we may well accelerate the start of the pool project. It's a difficult one to forecast, I think, because managers always fear that if they say, I'm not going to spend it, it'll be taken away, and that's not the case. It will just be deferral and roll on, but we reserve the right to review whether that particular project is still relevant, And as Nicola will know, one of the issues that was raised by our external auditors is the fact that we don't project manage very well. Now we've got plans to revise that and improve that. We're implementing a project gateway which allows projects to come forward. Thank you very much indeed. Allows projects to come forward so we can assess them, but not necessarily commit to them at that point in time. They might not be ready, we might be waiting for funding, but at least they're in the programme. And that leads to being able to have a more dynamic programme, because certain things will come forward at an accelerated rate. All of a sudden, LGF, the LEP's got extra money, wants to get rid of it, that project all of a sudden comes available. So I think within the context, my view is we've still got probably an over-programmed capital expenditure plan for next year. But that's what managers have provided, and we'll try and make them stick to that.
Chair, that was my concern. We talked about this more robust way of assessing capital bids with a view, and I anticipated that the total capital programme would be reduced as a result. There doesn't seem to be evidence of that at this point, but it's something I certainly will be keeping an eye on.
And I think that's fair to say. I think what we will do, if you want to have a separate project, because it's almost there now, is the new capital project gateway, which allows projects to, as I say, be assessed through. Everything's done on an investment appraisal process, so you can calculate what the net present value of that investment is worth and demonstrates how it's funded in a slightly more detailed way. It will take time for that to embed, but we're working quite closely, certainly with the regeneration team on some of their projects, and the pool in particular, where we're actually trying to get a real fine handle on how those major projects are actually managed and progressed through. As I say, we have to do it because we've been criticised for it by our auditors.
Thank you, Mark. Councillor Kerr.
Thank you. I've got three areas I'm wanting to explore, and they're all in the looking forward and what happens next theme. The first one is on the assumptions and the, I think you'd agree, optimistic assumptions, because if they weren't relatively optimistic, we wouldn't be needing to write in the extra reserves. So if 1, 2, 3 of those things are happening, and the additional cost for the first year, for 18-19, goes up by, I think you suggested something like £4 million, which needs to come out of reserves. We're then looking at the following year, which will no longer again be a balanced budget, and the following year, which will no longer be a balanced budget, and the year after that. Have those progressive elements, if inflation costs, sales costs, etc., start going up, and looking at the trajectory for those, have you done any work on that?
The short answer is yes, because we've got a more dynamic model that we can actually project forward quite quickly, so we can change that assumption and see what the impact is over time. I think realistically against those assumptions, and this was quite a significant debate we had in the summer with Cabinet, if we recognise and make a decision that that assumption is going to actually happen, then it immediately becomes a pressure and we have to find a saving to offset it in that year. And that means cutting staff or services in that year. If it's just an assumption and we're taking a risk on it, as long as it's a managed risk and we can keep it under review and monitor the impact as it arises, then we can actually avoid making slightly more draconian cuts to our services and our staff levels than we actually needed to. Because if the alternative would be, I'll put £4 million of pressures into the budget, we have to identify those savings and we start to plan for those savings to be in place from the 1st of April. That might mean individual jobs removed without then aren't actually necessary because the risk didn't arise. My concern is, though, that having taken made those assumptions, it does add risk to the council, the delivery of that budget, and therefore we should forgive me, I'm an accountant, wouldn't. It's prudent to offset that against a reserve. And you do have capacity to do that in your reserve portfolio at this moment in time. So my view is, if we don't have to make the savings, by crystallising the pressure, that's a good thing. But at the same time, we do have to recognise that they could go wrong and therefore make provision for it through the reserves.
Thank you. So it's just a matter of knowing what you might have in your back pocket in terms of savings partway through a year to start to address that for the following year.
Sorry, is a very good point. Budgets don't stop. So this is a point in time. It remains a budget until it becomes a plan, then it'll become a variance. So it's for the management team, the officer group, to continue to review all their activities, and whenever possible, we should take efficiencies or make improvements to those actual service plans.
Right, thank you. Now, the second one on the same theme is looking at the demographic pressures, which has already been talked about, particularly in adult care. And there was comment earlier that we really don't have the figures behind that on which to be able to scrutinise the judgment that has been made. So hopefully Andy's going to come up with the goods on that one. But there's a balance here between that 65 plus group and obviously the 85 plus group and those other groups which are all moving. And we've got the saving of the Live Well scheme, and I think the Live Well scheme dies completely at the end of this year. But we've still got those pressures building up. And so it's really the management thinking between a demographic pressure and a reduction in the mechanism for trying to contain that pressure, and what we're really doing on that.
I'm sure Andy can answer all those questions better than I, but I'll just make 2 points. The first one is that demographic analysis was well presented through the summer to Cabinet. Unfortunately, we've not got it here, but the information is available, so if you want it, I'm sure we can provide it for you. And on the other element of adult social care and those demographics and the impact that might have, I think Andy and the team continually manage and monitor that. The 65 seem to have stabilised for a little while. The 85s will look like they'll come through. But all that information is available, I'm sure. As I say, Andy can answer it far better than I.
Andy?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. We have a whole range of data and modelling underpinning our analysis around demographic pressures in adult social care, and indeed the increasing demand we're seeing in children's social care as well, both in terms of what we're currently seeing coming through the front door and also what we're predicting, both in terms of the over 65 population, the over 85 population, and what we're likely to see in terms of children who need to be looked after and children who are going to be in need or will be subject to child protection plans. And very happy to talk about that in more detail outside the meeting, and it may well be something that adult scrutiny may want to interrogate in more detail. I suppose the point I'd want to make is that all the range of ways in which we try and manage demand within children's and adult services, so through our community-led support in adult social care, our local area coordination, the work we do through the Healthy Housing Hub, our early help offer, all of this is around trying to manage demand and to avoid future costs coming into the system, whilst ensuring that we've got robust and business as usual arrangements for reviewing the packages of care and the work that we do with our service users, be that children or adults and their families going forward. The Live Well issue, just to pick up on that, so Live Well is the Council's lifestyle, behavioural change and public health prevention offer, and delivers a whole range of services such as smoking cessation, community health checks, weight management for adults and children, and is a strong performing service, but is a discretionary service. And as part of the Budget X process we went through coming up to 3 years ago, where we were looking at all of the discretionary services, Budget X, the Live Well service was put forward in the third year of what will be the MTFP coming into the year, into 2018-19. But throughout this last year, we've been doing a lot of work to look at how we can try and deliver our Live Well service in a different way, working differently with the users, working differently with the CCG, because I think everybody recognises that the service is important and the benefits are significant for the people that go through the programme. And there's been a lot of discussion at our Health and Wellbeing Board over the past 6 months about the Live Well service. What we had identified in year going forward was a relatively small public health reserve of £300,000, which would therefore mean that the reduction would not be £1 million, it would be 700,000 going forward. That would have led to a different type of Live Well service, probably one that was focusing more on the smoking cessation and the weight management, but that was where we were assessing was the kind of the greatest need. And that proposal was discussed at our Health and Wellbeing Board, and Councillor Kerr and Councillor Webb were both there, and we had that conversation. And the CCG were very clear at that meeting around the impact they saw in even remodelling around a £300,000 financial envelope. So what followed, and this is all subject to the outcome of the budget consultation, so no decisions have been made yet because that needs to come out of the consultation process, is going forward, really a view following conversation with Councillor Repton and in the Chief Officer Group about maintaining the 1 million cost going forward for another year, whilst we do further work with the CCG on co-producing a more sustainable model of delivery going forward. So, as is in the budget at the moment, is what's in the MTFP. In terms of what we might end up coming out with, by the time it goes to Cabinet and Council, will probably look different, in that we will be, I think, subject, not wanting to preempt the outcome, but I think the proposal on the table will be around maintaining the current level of provision while we do work to work up a different model, co-producing that with the CCG. We're very happy to get involved to look at that. But I think the view really that we've all taken is that this is a really important service. I think the challenge that we've got and that many councils have got is this is not statutory. And so you're left with those really unenviable challenges around the statutory versus the discretionary.
Thank you, Andy. Councillor Kerr, there are several members waiting, so if you make this the last point, thank you.
The final point was similarly on highways maintenance. This year, our ward was asked a number of highways maintenance, do you want these to be your priorities? And I expect the same has been true for everybody, which rather indicates that our highways maintenance budget is feeling the pressure, and I know that historically it has been a problem, and we know we're not investing sufficiently in our roads on an annual basis to maintain them at a given level. So really, I'm just saying, what is going to be happening? What's going to be implications going to be for road safety, for claims against us, and that sort of thing?
Would you like to pick up that, Christine?
I can try. I mean, I think every year we come round to talk to the neighbourhoods about priorities that they might want to select to go into the Highways and Transport programme. I'm not picking up any additional pressure, particularly with the highway maintenance budget, only that they are perhaps, suggesting to members that these are things that are of key priority for them. There might be things where requests they know have come from members of the public, and so they're putting it back to the neighbourhoods. But the government have been allocating additional monies for highway maintenance to do with the deterioration in the roads because of the weather, etc., and that's continued. We've also have got a highways asset management plan that the DFT are happy with, and as part of that we get additional funding coming through. So that's not to say that we can't always spend more money on highways, but I don't perceive that things are particularly more difficult than they've been in previous years.
Councillor Barker.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm referring back to the consultation document, page 6, and the service pressures, especially the one relating to the apprenticeship levy of 325k. My understanding of the levy was quite simply the council were committed to spend, I think it was just over £800,000, which goes into government, but then we spend it again. And as a result of that, I think there was a commitment from the government, say if we actually exceeded it, they would pick up the rest of the tab. Has that changed? Because why have we got a £325,000 pressure?
We've yet to contract with the provider to make sure that we do get those apprentices through and make the trainings payments that will offset that levy. So the levy is being charged. It's 850,000, I think it is, in total. The first amount of that pressure, because it started this year, is in this year's budget. The 325 represents the balance of the 850 in a full year impact, because it's then fully built into the budget. Once we start to be able to apply those, recruit those apprentices and apply the training to them, then we'll use some of that through, but we still have to pay the money out either way. So there will be a slight reduction in future years, but yet we've got no plans because we haven't yet managed to get a provider in place to actually deliver that service. I'm going to cough it. Excuse me.
The diversion. Was there a follow-up, Councillor Parker? Was that it?
Does that help?
We'll have to work quickly, otherwise we may be without a Director of Finance.
Unaccustomed as I am.
Yeah. Councillor Skelton.
Thank you, Chair. A few months ago at my scrutiny committee, the Community Scrutiny Board, we had a presentation, courtesy of Councillor Bayliss, about CCTV. And the board did make a recommendation back to Cabinet saying if there was any way we could actually see a system brought into the city centre, which was obviously lower cost than the previous one, we would like to see that. We haven't had any feedback on that as far as I know, but I'd like to know what happened to that request, please.
Christine, CCTV?
I'm aware that there have been a number of further discussions around that. Within the service, we have moved the responsibility for managing CCTV into Community Safety Service, and I know that they have been in discussions with the police and other stakeholders. So I'm happy to get you an update on that. As far as I'm aware, I think we found a solution for the CCTV situation, but I'm not clear on the details, so I can come back to you on that.
So if we can get that clarity, thank you, Christine. Was that Councillor Skelton, is that it? Yep. Councillor Ralston, please.
Hello. Thank you, Chair. Right, in terms of point 20 on page 16, the biggest figure, as I'm always told to look at by a certain somebody, the reality of this one is £3.36 million in savings across basically not replacing staff, vacant positions, etc. Equivalently, presumably on an average of 27k per year with the UK average, that's around 124 staff, give or take, one way or the other. Where are these staff currently in terms of where are the current vacancies that we're not replacing? Where is it going to impact mostly? How is it going to impact on the council's running, the stress, the morale of the staff, and the risk factor of implications of all those losses effectively, please?
We did actually respond to this question earlier with Councillor Card, but we can pick it. It's okay. Don't worry. We'll do it again. So this is a whole...
It was the A52.
Ah, you see. Yeah, but you get a new road. So this is a whole raft of things, including tackling our attendance issues around sickness, which have been well described at this scrutiny committee before, and a whole mix of other things. We've used an average of 33,000 for 100 staff. That's roughly what it works out with on costs and everything else. And we've, at this moment in time, as we described earlier, we've no specific plans. It's not an individual or a person or a post that's been targeted. It forms part of the general review that this council has taken to continue to enhance its work processes and improve efficiency of task delivery. It is a key issue for debate around getting a formalised plan out. Christine, I think, described it in far more eloquently than I did, and I'm going to cough again, so apologies.
Christine, do you want to add to that?
I think all I would, again, reiterate, I think this is a really focused drive on the biggest cost that the council has around its staffing budgets. And I think we just need to be relentless about making sure that we have high-performing staff, we take out any inefficiency, we support staff around absence management, but if they genuinely are not best placed to be at work, we need to help them into a different place. We need to continually review when there are vacancies, do we really need them, or can we look at a way to restructure to take those out so we minimise the impact on services. But I think it is fair to say that it is a big chunk in 18-19, and I think, you know, we are looking at how achievable that is going to be and having those challenging discussions with the Cabinet members. But I think there's just a feeling that this is the biggest element of spend and we really need to be a bit more focused about how we drive out some of that efficiency.
And then in reference to there's a number of big consultations in place at the moment around SEN and care, etc., and presumably there's an element of risk within those. Obviously, I know that they're not affecting the budget as such, because it's improving like for like effectively, but whatever the changes will be, will have an element of risk of challenge to them, shall we say. Are those taken into consideration within this budget at the moment, because some of those will be implemented within 17-18 effectively?
Essentially, we have a number of significant consultations taking place within people services. Nicola, you mentioned SEND. The consultation actually comes to an end next week. I have to say that to date the consultation has run very well, and we've got some very useful comments back, but there's an awful lot for us now to work through, because we are essentially, without getting into too much detail, and we talked about this at CYP Scrutiny in some depth, turning a tank in terms of how we meet the needs of young people that have got special educational needs or disability, essentially trying to ensure that we keep more children locally in Derby, that we have more of our schools taking a more inclusive approach, and that we reduce the number of children that we're placing out of authority. But I suppose the point that I'd want to make in relation to trying to answer your question is that what we have done within people services, which isn't linked to the budget, but is more around how do we use the experience and the staff that we've got with the right skills, we are identifying and focusing on what are those really kind of key strategic priorities that we've got within people services, like the SEND review, for example, like the review we're doing around the banding of special school costs, how we tackle and deal with the rising costs of personal budgets for younger adults, and we're working across the whole of people services, so that's adults, children's and public health, identifying the right members of staff with the right skills, the right capacity, and focusing on those 3 or 4 top priorities rather than trying to do everything, so that we're not overloading staff unduly, but also trying to utilise and work across service areas to tackle some of those really big strategic priorities that we've got.
In which case, I think that's everyone. Councillor Webb, did you have another? Go on then.
God, you've encouraged me. I know
Councillor Repton got to leave. He was.
I note on page 2 that we're looking at struggling families. You've mentioned JAMS just about managing. What effect would that have on the budget? What allowance do we make for uncollected council tax? Because council tax collection varies across the city from 80% plus in some wards to just below 100% in others. And for last year, that was an impact of around £5 million. So if we don't do anything to encourage people to pay council tax, what effect will that have on our budget, and what allowances are we making in there?
As you'd expect. Oh, I was going to speak then and it didn't come out. As you expect, we do use quite a lot of trend analysis in terms of estimating what the collection rate is going to be on a council tax from our tax base. It used to be very easy because everyone paid council tax, but with the implementation of the council tax reduction scheme, that means there's a cohort of taxpayers, council taxpayers, who have a reduced sum, and they tend to be in the most deprived areas, the most economically deprived households. We monitor that trend very well, and we're pretty accurate. So our collection rate, our collection fund, at the end of each year when we formally assess it and publish it in our accounts, for council tax is usually pretty accurate. Where we do have the other problem is with our business rates collection, where as the economy, shall we say, it's fragile in parts, and we've discussed this in terms of write-offs at Scrutiny as well. Occasionally those organisations cease to trade, but more importantly, we know that there are organisations around who are trying to support businesses with business rate appeals. The problem when they submit a business rate appeal, it's locked. And we had quite a large inflow of that last year, resulting in a £3 million deficit on the collection fund for business rates. We continue to monitor it, and we're not seeing the same number of appeals coming through. So it seems to have been someone's gone into the market, stimulated businesses to challenge, and that's eased away. But it is more difficult to forecast business rate collection rates than it is to forecast council tax collection rates. At the moment, and if you recall, in the budget monitor, we now report those collection rates, and from memory, on the Q2, both for the collection rate, for the money we've actually got in this year, is higher in both council tax and business rates. So we're not seeing a shortfall, but I guess it could be one of these things where all of a sudden you just hit a barrier, and then people just can no longer pay or choose not to pay. I think the council's policy is for those individuals that won't pay, we have a zero tolerance, and we'll go and chase them, and we'll send the bailiffs out if we need to. For those households that cannot pay, we'll try and do our best to ensure that they maximise their benefits and support them through welfare payments as best we can. Does that help?
Councillor Shanker.
Thank you, Chair. Just for clarification, really something I wanted to point out in the forward of the budget consultation document, about halfway down the page, it talks about the funding cuts to the council since 2010. That figure's incorrectly typed there. It should be 135 million and not 80 million.
Well spotted, Councillor Shanker. And on that happy note, thank you very much. I think what is most tonight is obviously the detail will emerge. There's lots of assumptions in this budget paper, lots of challenging targets, and there will be much work to be done to scrutinise as the detail emerges, both of the budget and then of its delivery, which is actually the difficult bit. But I thank everyone for their contributions tonight, and thank you very much. Good evening.